So it gives me great pleasure to talk to Colin DeYoung. He's one of the great personality psychologists of our time. He's done some really impressive work. And of course, we did see him at the ISSID conference in Vienna in 2025. So, Colin, perhaps you'd just like to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your background.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, and great to see you in Vienna. So I'm Colin DeYoung, and I am a professor in the psychology department at the University of Minnesota, and I direct the personality, individual differences, and behavior genetics area of my department, and that's a PhD program that we offer there. And I'm just generally interested in personality and in its structure and its sources. So what are the most important elements of people's personality? How are they organized? And where do they come from? And I do a combination traditional psychometric research using questionnaires, cognitive tests, computerized tasks, various kinds of behavioral testing. But then I also do a lot of neuroscience research, mostly using MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, which is a way to scan the brain in order to try to understand how brain structure and function are related to differences in people's personalities.
Can you tell me a little bit about perhaps what inspired you to go down this career route and how you ended up doing what you are doing?
Certainly, yes. So as an undergraduate, I did not major in psychology. My major was in the history of science, actually. And actually went into my undergrad degree thinking that I would major in philosophy. As a freshman, I took a couple of boring philosophy classes and decided I needed to do something else, the kind of random decision making that 19-year-olds have. But so I ended up finding this sort of interdisciplinary cognitive science program. And most of the tracks of that program were in the kinds of things you would conventionally think about with cognitive science, like behavioral neuroscience, computer science. But then there was one track that was based in more of a humanities perspective, which was the history of science. And I was coming out of a more humanities background, but I was very interested in issues around consciousness and, how people work, things that in retrospect, I recognize were quite psychological. And so I ended up studying the history and philosophy of science, getting some credit for some philosophy classes and also some psychology classes. And I was studying the history of psychology and psychiatry. But one of the requirements of that major was that whatever you were studying, whatever discipline you were studying historically, you also had to take some current classes. And that was how I ended up taking psychology classes. And I took about, let's say, a minor's worth of psychology classes. And the very first one that I took was an introduction to personality psychology. And I just immediately found that interesting and realized that a lot of the questions that I had in general, just about why people were the way that they were and why people are different from each other and how different people figure out what to do with their lives, like all those questions. I had no idea previously that there was actually an academic discipline that specialized in addressing those questions. And so then by the time I got to the end of my undergrad degree, I decided I wanted to keep studying psychology, but in the modern scientific vein instead of historically.
That is such an interesting start to have come through philosophy. And I think I understand now how this has helped mold your approach to the way in which you write articles, which I think always does have that big picture philosophical slant to them. And when I listened to your keynote address at the ISSID conference in Vienna, I think that's exactly what you were trying to capture. Perhaps you'd like to just tell me then a little bit about what you're working on at the moment, and that might also include some of what you were talking about at that keynote address.
Yeah, certainly. So, as I said, I have these kinds of two sides to my work, some of which is more neuroscience focused and some of it which is more conventionally psychometric. And I guess I might also add even a third strand, which would be the kind of more purely theoretical kind of work, trying to really integrate everything and figure out how it fits together into, as you said, the big picture. In terms of what I talked about in my keynote in Vienna, I really wanted to give a summary of what we've been doing in my lab for the last 15 years or so, trying to understand the biological basis, the brain basis of different personality traits. And that was partly because of the fact that the award is named in honor of the founder of ISSID, right, Hans Eysenck. He was really the first person to systematically try to put together evidence and think about the neurobiology of personality. And he talked a lot about the neurobiology of extroversion and neuroticism, and partly because of him, we have a lot of probably our best and most established research findings in personality neuroscience are about the neural basis of extroversion and neuroticism, which are related to the brain systems involved in reward and punishment, respectively. And so a lot of my research has focused on the other three of the big five, trying to branch out and understand where those might be coming from in terms of what the brain does. So I talked about my research on conscientiousness and its links to a large-scale neural network that is seems to be involved basically in allowing people to prioritize goals effectively and address their attention to things that are goal relevant and away from distractions. And then I talked a bit about my research on, or our research on, agreeableness, which seems to basically encompass all of the traits that are related to variation in altruism and cooperation. And one of the things that we need in order to cooperate with each other, which is, obviously crucial as a social species, is to be able to understand a bit about what's going on in other people's heads, right? We have to have some kind of a model of another person as another agent with their own goals. And people who are highly agreeable are more likely to take other people's goals into account and try not to, infringe on them or disrupt them when they're making their own decisions and taking their own actions. And we have shown that the systems that underlie social cognition, social information processing, are typically predictive of people's differences in agreeableness. And then the last of the big five there would be openness to experience and intellect, that kind of broad factor reflecting people's tendencies toward all these kinds of cognitive flexibility, cognitive exploration, basically the capacity to flexibly absorb and work with information about the world in order to develop the models that we use to navigate the world, whether those are more perceptual related to openness or more intellectual related to intellect. And that's been some of the most interesting work that we've done, I think, because you really have to separate out those two parts of the broader trait, openness versus intellect, because they seem to have quite different neural correlates. And openness to experience actually is associated with a lot of similar neural correlates that are related to risk for psychosis, whereas intellect, the questionnaire-based version of intellect, intellectual curiosity, intellectual engagement, confidence, that seems to be more associated with a lot of the same neural substrates as intelligence. And so that's kind of an interesting juxtaposition because, of course, those things go together in the same factor. And you think, well, intelligence and schizophrenia, those seem like quite opposite. And indeed, they're negatively correlated. But this capacity that is associated with openness for more flexible and open-minded thinking and drawing broad connections and having sort of divergent associations, the trade-off with that is that it does put people at slightly more risk for problems relating to psychosis, which basically amount to taking those patterns too far and not being good at sorting out which ones are real and which ones aren't. So I've had a lot of just sort of fun and curiosity and interest and excitement trying to understand openness and intellect better over the years.
I think that's such interesting research to be able to start trying to understand some of the cognitive and physiological mechanisms, understanding the way personality works. I see the implications for academic research, but can you perhaps tell me a little bit about the implications of your work for broader society?
Well, I think that in a lot of ways, what I do is really very basic research, which means that I'm not usually thinking about the direct application of this to solving problems. Now, I do have a line of research that I really haven't mentioned yet, which is more increasingly focused on risk for psychopathology and mental health problems, because it turns out that the major dimensions of personality also map onto the major dimensions of risk for different types of psychopathology. And so although what I'm doing is, really aimed at just kind of trying to understand the sources of this variation, that should also be helpful in trying to understand the sources of risk for different types of mental health problems. So the research that we're doing may ultimately be useful in understanding mental illness better, and potentially even in designing new interventions, whether that's just because it gives us more insight into the psychological processes that are going on in mental illness, or whether it may be even about more direct biological interventions into particular brain systems. So, I tend to think about it just in terms of my usual passion for synthesis and seeing the big picture and kind of figuring out how this stuff fits together. But I do think it also has potentially important applications, especially in mental health.
Thank you so much. And then just one final question, if I may. So I'd say you're one of the top academics in the field of personality. How did you get to reach that kind of level? And have you got any advice you'd like to give to upcoming PhD students and early career researchers to be able to reach that level of influence that you have achieved?
Well, first of all, it's very kind of you to say that I am one of the top researchers in the field. And, I think, of course, if you are a young academic, of course, you're inspired and hoping to have some kind of an impact on your field. And I think, the way to do that is to pursue things that you are really deeply interested in, because that just makes it a lot easier to work hard, and to do work that is going to be meaningful not only to others, but also to yourself. And I think that one of the important things to think about is the quality of measurement. That's one of the things that I like about personality and individual differences in general as an area of psychology, is that there's a long and deep tradition of paying careful attention to the quality of our measurements. So for example, recently I wrote a paper with a number of other people who are working in this area of neuroscience of individual differences, both in terms of more normal personality and in psychopathology, essentially trying to give pointers to that field on how to do individual differences research better. Because as different fields start becoming more interested in individual differences, they often end up sort of reinventing the wheel, or even worse, like failing to realize they need a wheel when it comes to the quality of their assessments, and even just things like needing to have a large enough sample size to do individual differences research instead of what neuroscientists are often used to, which is within subjects comparison of what the brain is doing in different conditions, where you're just trying to make a generalization about how the human brain works for people on average. Whereas, of course, we're trying to figure out what are the differences between people and how are they important. So paying attention to measurement issues and getting that right is crucial. Pursuing things that you're interested in. And then I guess, just looking around at the areas of psychology that you're interested in and thinking about, what's missing? What are the mysteries? What are the things that would be really important to know about that we don't know about yet? I don't know whether this is good advice or bad advice, because I don't know, Thomas Kuhn's distinction between normal science and revolutionary science. So normal science is science where there's a well-established paradigm, ways of understanding the phenomena you study, methods that people use in general, and progress is often incremental but steady, right? It's like you go into a chemistry lab and you're going to figure out, like, how does this particular substance or material work chemically? How can we make it stronger, or what can we use to interact with it in a way that's more effective? There's nothing particularly revolutionary about it, even though it's a crucial and important part of what the science is doing. In psychology, we tend to have fewer established paradigms, fewer known facts, fewer methods that everybody agrees on. And that always appealed to me about psychology. I think that's part of that coming out of philosophy, was like I wanted a field where I could think a lot about stuff that wasn't already nailed down. And so, when I was describing my personality neuroscience trajectory, a lot of it really was like, well, we already know a lot of stuff about extroversion and neuroticism, so I'll focus on the other traits. But in a way, that's making your life harder, because in fact, although we know more about extroversion and neuroticism in terms of like what's exactly going on in the brain and where these things come from, we still know very little. We just have some more. We've established the first few footsteps, you might say, along the path. But even that was maybe a little too much for me. I was like, well, there are these other ones that we know nothing about. That's what I want to study, And so I guess you kind of have to figure out what the right balance is for you as an academic in terms of going after things where there's already kind of an established trajectory and you can make incremental progress, versus looking around for things where, nobody's done that yet. And why hasn't anybody worked on this particular question? And it's a larger question than just like, what's the next step on this established path? And I guess that's probably like a more high risk, high reward kind of strategy, right? I mean, and it's obviously worked for me, which I feel very fortunate about, but it may be that if you start trying to do something that nobody's done, that you won't succeed, or that there's a reason that nobody's done it. But it may be that you make some real advances, and then people are going to notice that probably more than they will notice just incremental progress in some area where there are a lot of people already working. So I guess that's the best I can do is not like definite advice, but sort of here's the range of possibilities, and you should base your decision on your own personality and what suits you.
I think that's super good advice. Colin, I'd just like to thank you very much for sharing a little bit of your very valuable time with us. And I'd just like to wish you all the best for all those future academic adventures, which I'm sure will be coming your way. So thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.